policeman, then being an acting inspector at Frankston and dealing with the criminal mind. There wasn't much difference between the criminal mind and the KG footballer who wouldn't train hard or would like to have a free kick or anything like that. Bryan's mind was very much about reading the person, reading the player, and his ability to be able to do that came from his training from in the police force. When you're dealing with somebody that's committed a crime or you believe has committed a crime, you need to be able to read that person to ensure that that person is the right person that you're looking at. Football is much the same. I suppose if you turn around and you look them in the eye and say, are you going to give me 100% today? And that return doesn't come that way, that's when Bryan would be right onto you and would know straight away. He didn't have to sit down there with a whole lot of stats and saying, oh, you've only had 3 handballs today and you've only had 1 shepherd. No, didn't need that statistic. That mental statistic is what Bryan had.
Bryan to me, I love that bloke. I've just got so much respect for what he's been able to do for this community and this club. He's given up, such a huge chunk of his life, and he's done that basically just to give young kids from the peninsula and from the eastern suburbs and, at Berwick Way and stuff, just a chance to be able to play at VFL footy without having to go through all the crap of being affiliated with an AFL side. Like, any time you talk to a player who's been involved at a VFL club that's affiliated with an AFL club, the first thing they say is, I was playing good footy but I got dropped because so-and-so was coming back from an injury. Whereas down here, that's just something you don't have to deal with. It's just such a tight club, and that's because of Bryan. He's fought tooth and nail, and it's got nothing to do with ego whatsoever. He's doing this, like I mentioned earlier, just to be able to give guys, like myself and hundreds of other guys, the opportunity to be able to play a great level of footy and give yourself a chance to get drafted if you miss out. Like in my time that I played here, I reckon sort of 6 or 7 guys got drafted. Matty Boyd, my first year, who's gone on to be a captain at AFL level and All-Australian. Ryan Ferguson got drafted to Melbourne. Chris Bryant went to Collingwood and Carlton. Aaron Edwards obviously got redrafted after spending a year here. Michael Hibbard, Marcus Murigliani, Tory Dixon, who I think he got picked up when he was at Bendigo but played most of his footy here. Same with Jimmy Magna. So there's just been so many guys who got drafted, having played here, and all those guys and myself and everyone just owe such a gratitude to Bryan for doing all the work he's done to make sure that we've got that opportunity to do that. So as I said, I just have so much respect for Bryan, and will forever be grateful for him fighting. I know the Wolves were at the door at one stage and Carlton were pressing really hard, but he stood up and said, no, Frankston are going to be standalone. They're going to give the opportunity to young kids to come here and play VFL footy, and I'm just so grateful that he did that. And I love catching up with Bryan once a year at the Past Players Day, and hopefully I can do that for a lot of years to come.
I guess the first time that I was aware that there was a Frankston Park when I was 13 years of age, attending the local primary school only 100 metres or so from here, and the teachers organised a game against the Catholic mob in the school opposite. Now, I can remember marching down with my colleagues with our school jumpers on, football jumpers on, into Frankston Park to play the casts, as we used to call them, or the mix. They were all in good fun. And I entered the parkway through the gate nearest to the school, and I saw this magnificent, beautiful ground, the old grandstand, the old toilet block that was sitting exactly where I'm sitting now making this film. And I think that was what we used to call the kindergarten, situated up where the terraces are now, was in place, and that was the time I fell in love with Frankston Park, and that was my first game of football, Frankston State School versus the Frankston Catholic School. I think we won simply because we had a population of our school probably 500 or 600 more than what the poor opposition club did. The next time I played here was at Frankston High School as a 14-year-old, I was trying to go from our junior team at Frankston High, then situated opposite the state school, where the tech school is now, for want of a better word. And I was hoping for selection in the senior squad at the high school. And I can remember the captain of the senior squad coming into our classroom one day and saying, "Macey, you've got a game for this Wednesday." Went home and told Mum and Dad I was getting a game with the senior team on Wednesday, and we all fronted up at the ground, Mum and Dad, a couple of aunties and uncles and my grandparents, all sitting up on what are now the terraces. And I went into our room to change, and to my dismay and total embarrassment, I was told by our captain I had a game, but I was to play with the opposition club because they were short of players. So I had to run out in a green and gold jumper representing the Balcombe Army camp, who had a senior team. They were all around about 18 years of age, playing the high school senior team, and I was on the wing for the opposition team. Instead of playing with Frankston High, I was playing with the boys from the army camp down at Mount Martha. You can imagine how disappointed I was running around right in front of Mum and Dad and my rally sitting there, and I was in the opposition jumper. So I couldn't get home quickly enough, went straight to my bedroom, and the old man had to come in and pacify me a bit because I'd felt that I was so embarrassed and shamed myself in at least getting a game, but with the opposition. So that was my first game, proper game, I guess you could say, on Frankston Park. 12 months later, at the age of 14, around about 1950, or it was 1950, I joined the junior club at Frankston here. I think it was either under 17 or under 18, coached then by a fellow by the name of Matthews, and it was Herb Matthews, and he was the father of the Matthew brothers that have gone on to become legendary names, or particularly Lee went on to become probably recognised as one of the greatest players in the competition. His father was my first coach at Frankston. I can remember those two boys later on playing under the grandstand lights, and they were the only lights we had at the ground. One light at each end, and it lit the ground out, mud heap just in front of the grandstand. And I can remember Lee, and I think it was Kelvin was his brother's name, playing kick to kick under the lights. I'd say they probably would have been about 7 or 8 years of age as I got on a bit hanging around with their dad. So that's a thing that's always stuck in my mind. As I met Lee over the years, I would always remind him of how his dad had to keep telling him to use his handkerchief and wipe his nose. So then I went on and started to play with the juniors. I was captain of that team for a couple of years. We won a couple of flags. Then I went on and around about 18 years of age started playing with Frankston seniors. You need to recognise that back in those days there were only 8 senior clubs in the particular competition. There was Frankston, Sorrento was a big club, Hastings were always there, and your Chelseas, Seaford. You didn't have any of the surrounding clubs such as Coringal or Pines or YCW, which is the main towns. The competition was tough, but as you should realise, Frankston's population was probably 35,000, 40,000 playing against the other small towns like your Seafords and your Hastings. So we should have won plenty of flags, but I always, and I hate to admit it, I always felt we were a team of soft cocks. And it annoyed me quite strongly to think that we often struggled when we got to finals to beat the likes of Hastings or Mornington had a fair sort of population. But we, as gateway to the peninsula, we had a lot of players on the training track. You could have 150 at the start of a season. You might whittle it down to 90 or so, and the players that couldn't make it would go and play at the surrounding clubs, and we'd be playing against those boys that didn't make it with us. And we'd always get to finals, but very seldom win the finals. I got relegated, unfortunately, because I was looked upon as an aggressive type of player, I suppose. I finished up getting stuck at centre half back and then full back, and only being a very short 6-footer. I used to have a lot of trouble playing against the guys back in those days who were looked upon as tall players at 6'2", 6'3" in the old measurement. So I had to devote my game to just punching away all the time, and I was very quick. I was a very, very good quick kick, and probably one of the quickest players in our club, so it was a case of punch and run. And I think in a couple of years I only averaged about 16 or 17 goals getting kicked against me in a total season. But I got that way. I hated playing at full back because you'd only have 4 or 5 strong clubs in the competition. The other clubs were weak and you'd be winning by 12 goals a match, which was a lot back in those days with the way football was played. So I could often lean against the goalpost with nothing to do, and I often itched to think I could be up and around the centre of the ground playing football there that would have really suited me. It was quite funny, we had a guy that came down from Seaford, and I think he was a reserves coach but had to take over in the senior team one particular year. Strangler Lewis, who turned out to be Ricky Lewis's, a player that was with us in the 78 grand final. Ricky played the club for 6 or 7 seasons. His dad coached me and had the brains, I thought, to put me in the centre of the ground for half a season, where I played really, really good football and was looked upon as the best centre man at that stage in the competition. But as soon as the regular coach came back, I get stuck on the back line again. So it didn't always pay to be an aggressive, what you might call rough and tough a player back in those days. I can remember I was so devoted to winning that at one stage after a game, it might have been one year when I was captain, I can remember having a row with a particular group of 3 guys that were brothers, and we had a bit of a spat under the shower. Well, if you've ever had a fight under a shower when the floor's covered in slippery soap and you're trying to stand up for yourself, and I remember the 2 brothers came to help their brother out, and the 3 or 4 of us fighting and scrambling around in the soapy shower, and all we're doing was bringing a bit of embarrassment upon ourselves. We had to front up before the committee and explain why we had this brawl, or a fight. I like to call it friendly, but I was trying to get them to understand that when we ran out on the ground we were supposed to win and not act the goat. So I wouldn't say that I was in love with my club at that time, because if we really looked at ourselves as being the major club, we should have won a lot more premierships. On another occasion, I was made captain when I was about 23 or 4, forget the actual times. There were a lot of senior players in the club. I was selected captain by the committee. I hadn't been married long, and I had a knock on the back door at the house I lived at Seaford, and it was one of the senior players there to tell me that some of them wouldn't play unless I reneged on being captain, because they felt at that age I was too young to be captain, and they felt that some of the older players should have been selected as captain, some of the 28, 29-year-old players, and would I mind resigning as captain and let one of them be captain of the club. So I went back and spoke to the president of the club and told him how disappointed I was that they hadn't spoken to the players before they selected me. And anyhow, one thing led to another, and I think I stood out for the majority of that season. I probably sulked a bit because the senior players didn't want me as captain, but it's good to talk about some of the things that you learn from. I tried to come back towards the end of the year because I could see we were going to play in a grand final. I did come back, but I couldn't get my fitness up, and played in a grand final, which we won with the reserves, and the seniors went on to win a grand final without me, and I'd been there for years. I played in 2 grand finals against Crib Point. People say, why Crib Point? How could Crib Point get up to the standard that Frankston must have been at? Because Crib Point probably only had a population of 500 or 600 people. But from the way I understood it, one of their committee men had sold a lot of his farm to Lysart, or one of the big oil companies that went down there at that stage, and I think he donated 10,000, I heard, which would have been pounds, to the Crib Point Football Club, and they went out and purchased a lot of VFL players, AFL players, whatever you want to call them, and travelled down and played with Crib Point, and for 4 or 5 years they probably had the best Victorian Country Footy League side that's ever been put together. So they went from being a minnow of a football club to this fantastic club for 3 or 4 years, and they beat us in 2 grand finals in a row. And I can remember getting best and fairest in, I think it was the 57 grand final. I was playing really good football, and we were done by a point in virtually the last kick of the game. Probably the most recognised grand final on the peninsula for many, many years, and people still talk about it to this day. But we just didn't have a physically strong enough or experienced enough team to come up and beat Crib Point. They had a marvellous side. After that particular period, I joined the police force in '59, and it became very difficult for me to play senior football, or good senior football. I tried to for a couple of years, but back then you weren't really looked upon as being wanted to play football or any sport as if it came to that from the police point of view. So they made sure I couldn't get to training. I might be able to train once a week, tried to play on a Saturday. I couldn't keep my fitness up, so I gradually dropped away from being, I'll say it in my words, a very good player to an ordinary player, and gradually then dropped away over the next few years to really not being able to get to training at all, just depending on where I was stationed. And back then you didn't just stop at one station, you went where you were told. So at times I'd be at Footscray, Carlton, and to knock off work at 5 o'clock and get back here, and there was no lights. You get on the training track 6:30, it'd be dark, so you couldn't train. So I left the club and went out to Somerville, where I could play out at Somerville. And back in those days you probably could have played at Somerville without training at all if you had some ability, but it was a lovely little club, so I used to make sure whenever I wasn't working I'd go and train on my own out at Somerville and run around and kick a football to myself. I might get to training once a week if I was lucky and could manipulate it. What you would do, you'd swap your shifts with a player for cricket, so during cricket season you'd work for him, during cricket period and footy season cricketer would work for you. And I had 5 or 6 good seasons at Somerville. We got to one grand final, and I can remember we were playing Rye, and I can remember in the last quarter we were winning by a couple of goals, and I ran into somebody pretty heavily and broke my arm, and I was determined that we were going to win it. And I can remember strapping it up and tucking it under my jumper and saying to the opposition, I think I was playing midfield, a bloke by the name of Appleford. I'd gone to school with him at the high school. I said, now listen mate, you broke my arm. I said, I want to keep on playing on, so if you're going to tackle me, don't throw me to the ground, just hang on to me. And we had a bit of a grin together, and that's exactly what he did do, and we battled through. And I can remember right at the end of the day, again they beat us on the last kick of the day. So you do some stupid things in your life, but you don't feel pain when you're out on the footy track and you know you've got a chance of winning a grand final. It wasn't until I went in after the game and looked at my arm hanging there that I realised how bloody stupid I was. But it just shows you what my intent was when I ran onto the footy ground. It wasn't quite white line fever, but I'd do anything to win a football match. And I carried through with that sort of attitude when I was coaching later on, as what my expectations were as a player. So I was playing at Somerville, and I then got an invitation to come back and coach at Frankston. So I came back in, when was it, 1975. I came back here, and I'd been still playing out at Somerville. You know, I was starting to get up around the 40-ish mark, but still play a reasonable game. Came back here and started to coach the reserves, and suddenly found out that there was really no reserves team. I had to go and recruit my own players. So I think we won half a dozen games that year, but it was a real struggle. I played in a few of those games. I can remember playing down at Werribee, where I got best on the ground in about my 3rd game for the season in the seconds. Played against a bloke by the name of Price, who'd been a hitman with Coburg. Coburg, and here I am running out against this guy. So we had a little discussion and decided between us we wouldn't king hit each other. We got on with the game, and I played another game here against Camberwell, another game against Werribee that I can remember. Probably played half a dozen games, and I was about 40 with the reserves. Could have equipped myself reasonably well, but didn't have a great fitness tank back in those days, but I was still strong as a bull physically. The next year, 76, I coached the reserves properly. I recruited properly, and I was determined we'd win a flag. So in that particular year with the reserves, we went through. I didn't play, obviously. We had a good team then, and that was completely unnecessary. And we won a flag out at playing on the Northcote ground against Camberwell. Very good game. I think we won by 3 points from memory. We had a great team with John Locko and Richard Lewis, and a lot of the boys played in the 76 Reserves Premiership, and I had some of those boys still there in 1978 when we all went on with it. So that's about the gist of it, talking about my playing days. I can remember my 2 sons, Robert and John. It was sort of a family affair back in those days. Robert and John followed me when I was a player out at Somerville. They certainly didn't remember me as a player at Frankston, but I can remember a couple of times them peering over the fence. In one particular instance, when the Bond Beach boys got me down, I must have cracked a couple of their heads because I was rolled underneath the boundary fence, and there was quite a deep drain, about knee-high drain to drain all the water. And they got on top of me while I was in the drain there and held me down, and I couldn't roll sideways to get out. And I remember Robert and John leaning over the fence while the opposition players filled my face and mouth up with mud and everything while I couldn't get out of the drain. So all those little things come back to you as a player. I won't mention a lot of the incidents I got involved in, but my father was a very, very docile man, a big man of about 6'1", that was big back in those days. He'd never have an argument with anybody. He was on the football club committee for one or 2 years, and I can remember a big shindig starting out here against a guy by the name of Clark, who was playing with Hastings back those days. He was a giant of a man, and he'd beaten up a boy by the name of Neil McComb in a game at Hastings the year before when I hadn't been playing. I watched it from the grandstand and gave Neil McComb a real whack from behind, and Neil went down with a broken jaw. So the expectation was that next time we played them, old man Mace would get this Clark back. And I tried to in the game, and I can remember we were having fisticuffs right in front of the grandstand. It was an all-in brawl, and all of a sudden the guy that I was fighting against, this Clark, somebody jumped on his back and had their hands around his face and around his neck, and while I was throwing punches, I looked, and one ricocheted off the side of Clark's head and hit the top of the head of this dark guy that was hanging on. And turned around, it was my father. So I couldn't believe that while I'd been fighting, the old man had come out of the ground to help his son, and other fathers came in to finish up an all-in brawl, and I'd finish up skidding one off the guy's head that I was fighting, hitting my father on the top of his head. But all that sort of stuff happened back in those days. Another club that was very strong, as it still is, was Sorrento. They used to shut their shops down on a Saturday. Back in those days, you need to understand, there were no all-day shopping. Shops opened for Saturday mornings and they shut for the rest of the weekend. There was no television. We had a thing that we called a wireless, not a radio, same thing, but that was the old expression. That was our entertainment. Sorrento, when they were playing Frankston or Mornington, would shut their shops, and all the Sorrento shopkeepers and population had felt would follow their club. It would be nothing to have 6,000 or 7,000 people crowded into Frankston Park, 2 or 3 times the crowd, or 3 times the crowd that we get now to our games. They were marvellous times. The competition, unfortunately, fell in a bit of a hole for a few years in 1966. When Frankston left the competition, it created a lot of bad blood between local clubs and Frankston. Frankston club split into 2. The Bombers went their way and we took the name of, later on, the Dolphins. We wore the St Kilda jumpers in their first game. I wasn't here then, I was out at Somerville. So I mixed the actual split when Frankston went into the VFA. Owen Wicks and a couple of other boys and a couple of the older committee people carried through. So there was a lot of hatred left over between the Frankston Bombers and our newly formed club, whichever way. No one could ever decide which was really the main club. Didn't ever worry me. Everyone was playing football, and there was a good, clean, good spirit at each club back in those days. And it was a shame a lot of that feeling lasted for a long time. I felt quite glad that I hadn't been part of the actual split back then, and I didn't have to carry any of that notoriety, although it did continue on a bit when I became the manager here. So that's all I can really say about my playing days. I probably had 5 years of really, really good football. One thing that I often laugh about, I can remember going home of a night, probably when I was about 21, and Dad would say, "Oh, a bloke from Collingwood rang up to speak to you." We had the big old-fashioned black phones. I'd say, "Well, who was it?" He'd say, he said, "I don't know, I didn't take notice of his name." So anyhow, this went on and on and on until there was a knock on the door one night, and a bloke with the name of Jack Hamilton, who later came to coach Frankston, had been sent down to see me about going and playing at Collingwood, and he said, "Well, I'll pick you up and take you up to Collingwood and you can do a bit of training there," and blah, blah, blah. And then, it turned out it had been the coach of Collingwood ringing me for about 2 months, and I'd never bothered to ring back. I went with Jack Hamilton to Collingwood, and the first night, as we were all breaking up on the ground, I can remember going over to the senior squad to train, and the coach told me, I can't think of his name at the moment, that's terrible, shows I'm 80. He said, no, you go over and train with that squad, that's the second squad, you train there. And I thought, well, this is what my head was like in those days. I was a big head. I said, I didn't come up here to play seconds, I said to myself. So this happened on 3 nights, and one particular night after training, I remember sitting down with my head down in front of the locker, and the guy sat next to me, and it turned out to be Gablick, this huge pair of legs next to me, and I said to him, what's the idea? How long, I'm a recruit here, how long will I have to train with that other group? Oh, he said, he cut the story short, he said, you'll be probably expected to play with them for most of the season, you don't get a game here straight away. I said, oh, so now I never went back to Collingwood again. What an idiot. These are the days when you actually got picked up and taken up by, turned out to be a state full-back, Jack Hamilton, dropped off at home again, and I was stupid enough not to take advantage of the fact that I expected to get a game straight off with Collingwood and not playing in the reserve. So I did some stupid things with, I should have been more ambitious about playing at league level, but back then the only thing you ever read about it was in the Sporting Globe and the Herald. You didn't get all the publicity like you do now with all the televised stuff and Foxtel and that. So I was pretty ignorant what went on up there, and often regret that I didn't go on and take my football further, because if I had have been able to play VFL, well then the police force did allow you to play at that senior level of competition.
Bryan Mace is Frankston pretty much. This place wouldn't be here. It would no way be a standalone club that is still capable of punching above its weight. Bryan stood up to the big wigs at the AFL House and made sure that all of us players had a home to play at this high level of footy. Some great memories of Bryan, and he was certainly the godfather of this club, and the hardest part was probably getting beers out of him on a Mad Monday. Was probably my biggest involvement with Bryan, was trying to extract some free grog for the boys at the end of the season. But no, I had many great memories. I still laugh and joke with some of the boys. In my early days, we probably had the checkbook out and bought a few good recruits to the place, and I still remember vividly, I think we'd gone about 10-0 in my second season here, and we had our first loss of the season, and Bryan came in and read the riot act out to us and just gave it to us. And I still remember his sign off there, because on a Monday night we'd have some pasta or lasagna, and he just turned in disgust and he said, "Eat your lasagna, you ungrateful pricks," or something like that. So it was just a classic Bryan Mace moment back in the days. But Bryan certainly mellowed as he got on a bit, but yeah, he's just been a fantastic servant of this club. You know, his heart is always in the right place. Look, he was a hard bastard at times, but gee, his heart was always in the best interest of this club, and I certainly appreciate all the support that he's given me and all my mates that have played here. So congratulations, Bryan.
Bryan, again, complimented this footy club about the way we went about it in that era, and that was, you know, it was hard work and it was honesty, and you know, Bryan was always the sort of bloke that he come across as a tough man, but he really had a big heart, and he's the first guy that, you know, being a kid here at this football club, if I had an issue or, you know, things weren't going too well outside of football, he's the first one that would open his office door to you, and not just give you a result, but give you some vision and some direction on how to go about it. You know, another thing that springs to mind with Bryan is, you know, if we'd been going all right during the footy season, we had a couple of wins under our belt, and, you know, if we lost a couple in a row, you know, the coach would obviously come here on a Monday night and do his tape review, and you knew that you were in trouble when Bryan Mace was sitting behind the coach and was waiting for the coach to finish and done his review and the chat about the weekend, because Bryan didn't come into the rooms very often, but when he did, he gave his speech, and it was very honest, and he'd tell you exactly how it is, and there was no bullshit with Bryan, and when he spoke, you listened, and, you know, what he's done for this football club is unbelievable and amazing, and, you know, only have to see, you know, how many years he's put into the football club, but into the VFL. You know, he's a life member of the VFL, and I was lucky enough to be at the JJ listen that year, and he had like 250 to 500 people absolutely cacking themselves when he was awarded the life membership. You know, you look at the facilities here at Frankston, without doubt the best facilities I've seen at VFL level, and that's all due to Bryan. So, you know, Bryan being an ex-policeman and all that sort of stuff, bit of a hard nut. You know, when he said he's going to do something, he does it, and it's an absolute credit to him on how long he served this football club and what he's done for it.
I'd come back to the club from Somerville in 1975 to coach the reserves, which I did. We didn't do any good. I won the flag with the reserves in 1976, the year that Ray Davies and Josh Kendall had a fantastic group of players, as I thought then. And they went through the season and won most games, but unfortunately for Ray, he couldn't pull off the big one, and we lost the finals when the final series came around. Ray Davies was a particularly good coach, gentleman, and all round I learned a lot from Ray during the couple of years that I worked with him as, I think they called me chairman of the match committee then, or helper to put his teams together. He and Josh Kendall were a good partnership together. We played their final series at Paran and unfortunately just couldn't get over the board. For the reason that we'd paid out a lot of money during that season, the club, to cut a long story short, virtually went bankrupt. In 1977, it was Alan Wicks and a group of hard-working people, some of the names that I'll mention, got together. The committee virtually retired after telling players and the creditors and that they could only pay, it was either 20 or 10 cents in the dollar. Luckily, a lot of the local business people didn't push the barrow too hard to get their money, but we went out of business for a few hours sort of thing, or a few days, till the committee got its act back together again. And I think I was very lucky because there was no money available. They decided they'd approach me to see if I'd do the job of coaching for nothing. And I can remember sitting in the grandstand that's there behind me with Alan Wicks, and I think there were a couple others present, and they asked me if I'd be interested in coaching the club. And I said I'd always wanted to coach the senior part of the club, and I didn't ever think I'd get it simply because they couldn't find any other dickhead that would do it without getting paid, but I'd take it on board. I said, did they understand how difficult it would be approaching last year's players and telling them they weren't going to get paid and expecting them to stop on, approaching the new players that I'd have to get into the club and explain to them they probably wouldn't get much payment, or if they got anything it'd only be a meagre amount, what we might call petrol money. Everybody on the committee said that they understood that, so I ran with it. I was lucky enough that Chris Pavlo came on board. I'd grown up with the Pavlo family. I might just say at this stage there was Con Pavlo, Chris Pavlo and George Pavlo, all deceased now, but yeah, a real rock of the family around the local community. So Chris came on board. He'd played at Frankston with me right back in the 50s, 56, 7, 8, somewhere about those times, and had gone on and become a very good player at Carlton. Had a serious knee injury, Chris, and finished up coaching over in Tasmania. Then came back to Frankston and helped me. So I couldn't speak highly enough of Chris. He used to tone me down a bit when I'd be getting a bit obstropolous with some of the players or the committee. So he was a good playboy for me, where I could just sort of feed off him with good information, and he'd settle me down a bit if I was going a bit overboard with some of the things that I often did. Alan Wicks was a particularly good president. He had a group of people behind him that pulled things together financially. It was Stuart Webster that started off our fund days, that started to bring in a regular 15 to 20,000 on the fund days. Barry Cameron from Ritchie Stores, he was running Ritchie Stores then. Bill Livingston, Ian Shepherd, a real solid group of people. And the thing that I really appreciated as a coach, we had Bill Livingston and Barry Cameron, who were very busy businessmen, decided to run bingo at the Pier Hotel. So that gave me a lot of confidence in knowing that behind me there were people that could well and truly go and do other things with their lives, but decided to get behind the club and run bingo of a night. I think they did it 2 nights a week at the Pier Hotel, and whether we made money or not, I can't remember back then, but those guys were behind us. The players could see that they were behind us, and I can remember on the first training night, we just had the new rooms built by the council, very small rooms that we've now added on to over the years. And I can remember addressing the previous year's players and telling them that they weren't going to get paid, that I'd like them to stop, but if they didn't want to stop, knowing what the purpose of the club was, I wanted them to leave. I didn't want them to hang around the club waiting to get paid for something that wasn't going to happen. Some of them are a little bit overboard, and I can remember telling 6 or 7 of them that if they didn't like it, I wanted them to leave, so they did. So the guys that were left behind, there were probably only 7 or 8 that turned out to be senior players in the 78 year. Some of the other boys that stopped were the reserves that stopped on. We had some under-19 boys that were coming through that were going to be good players. And I leant back against the wall and they all sat around with their backs to the walls because we didn't have tables and chairs then, and told them that I expected to win a flag, and I kept a straight face because I felt truly that that's what I intended to do. There was a bit of giggling went around the room, and I heard for the first time what my wrath was like, so I got off to it very early, understanding if they were going to play football at Frankston, there was only one thing in my mind that had to be in their mind as well: we were going to win a flag. It was Johnny Stapleton, Ricky Lewis, Peter Geddes, Murray Bridgedale, Peter Tickell and others, and I shouldn't start mentioning names because I'll forget some of them at this stage. They stopped on. I then advertised in the Melbourne papers and explained that the club was in a position of financial difficulty and we were wanting players to come down and keep the club afloat. And I think we would have got down 60 or 70 players rolled up on the first training night that we'd never seen before: fat ones, skinny ones, short ones, long ones, all sorts of ones. So we ran them around the ground for a few training nights until they gradually dropped off and we finished up with some good players. We recruited the Alan Harpers, the Ray Orchards, a boy by the name of Ryan came down from Carlton with Chris Pavlo, brought him down, and we finished up with a really solid group of players. We had boys like Alan Danks, who was a local lad, didn't make the final squad in 78, but was a really, really good player. Brian Jones, young Alan Sampson, Peter Geddes, and so we went right through. My son Robert Mace. So a good mix of strong, hard players, good back line, guys that were totally committed to the club, and I was really pleased with the balance. And when I look back through the games over the years, I think we would have only had 5 or 6 players in and out at any given time. So we probably only played around about 26 or 27 players right throughout the year. So it was a tremendously exciting time leading up to the first game. We got a huge following started to take interest in us, probably to see whether we could hold the club together after reaching all those financial difficulties that we'd had in 77. Wixie and Ian Shepherd and his little group. There was an Alan Miller was involved as a manager in 77. 78, Adrian Lloyd, Rocky Lloyd as he's more commonly known as, came on board as the manager. So it was a group of people that really felt for our club. I was at that time in charge of what we called the local crime car squad at the police station. So I was getting a lot of publicity at that stage through things that I was doing at work. My wife was then, Margaret, she came on, was in charge of the ladies committee. She'd been teaching at the high school forever and a day. My sons were well known, sometimes for mischievous purposes around the town, but both well known. So the Mace family were well known. We had a lot of people behind us. Wixie and his group had a lot of people behind us, including businessmen. So everything was comfortable. We came up for our first game against Yarraville, and I wasn't too sure how we were going, but I knew that we were coming up against a club that was pretty tough and ready and willing. You had to be able to fight as well as play football in those days. So we beat Yarraville on that day, and it created a huge sense of successful atmosphere about Frankston around the club. And from that time on, we could rest assured that the least crowd that we'd get would be 3,000, and on the good matches against your Oakleys and Werribees, and those teams we'd have 7,000. Before doing this interview today, I went back and looked at some of the crowds, and there were 4 games at Frankston where there were 7,000 people, and the other games were between 3 and 4. So in those days they were fantastic crowds, people up on the trees, pine trees around, fantastic. We went to Camberwell in the next game, and they had a full forward by the name of Hammond, and I gave my players a lecture. And I was reasonably good on the motivation side of it. I gave them a lecture. I wanted Hammond kept out of business or put out of business, whichever way they wanted to do it. And we went overboard that day, and we turned the umpires against us because we were a bit over fanatical at putting Hammond out of the game and a couple of their other good forwards. Umpires turned against us, and we lost the game because the coach, being myself, had given the wrong directions about how it was to be played. So I learned from that game. That, in my mind, was the only time we really failed. We lost 2 other games. Out of the 20 games we played, I think we only lost 3. We lost another one out at Sunshine. I think we only lost that because the ground was so wide. The coach, for a start, couldn't see over the rise in the ground from where I was sitting over in the boundary. All you could see were the heads on the other side of the ground. Completely lost contact with what was going on throughout the game when we lost to Sunshine. And the other loss was to Northcote, out to Northcote in a mud heap one day. They did it. So that worked out pretty well. By losing 3 games, it gave me enough ammunition throughout the year where I had something on the players to keep revving them up about. So that was roughly was what the year was about. I made sure that off ground our players had people around them that could relieve the atmosphere that I used to create, which was one of strictness, one of discipline, one of the fact that they had to have respect for me and I respect for them. But we had to keep a bit of joviality in it. So I had Martin Hegney, more commonly known as Junior, and little Dickie, who was our property steward, and between them I made sure those 2 guys played plenty of jokes on the players to keep the humour going. Little things such as a duck being hidden in their locker when they open their locker, either before or after a game, a duck would jump out at them, or a blue-tongued lizard, all that sort of stuff. I didn't realise at one stage they were also putting it over the coach. The 2 of them would raffle off once a week a bag of potatoes, big sack of potatoes. I wanted 3 weeks in a row, and I used to have to carry it out to the car. When I got home, and I only lived a couple hundred metres from the ground, I'd put the sack of potatoes behind the fence, leave them there because it didn't really interest me to take the potatoes up for Margaret to cook. What I didn't realise, they woke up to that and they'd go down, pinch 1 bag of potatoes, bring it back and raffle it the next week. So they kept making sure I'd want it now and again so they could keep using the same sack of potatoes to raffle off. So we kept all that fun stuff going. Some of the things I look back on now, some of the modern day coach would look and think, well, he must have been a bit of a nut. We had a new shower room, all beautifully whited up, and nice big bath in it for Alan Harper, who used to like to soak himself in warm water before a game to get all the rheumatics out of his bones. But above the bath there was just a lot of white tiles. So instead of having 2 showers like we had opposite over under the grandstand, we had 6 nice shower heads. And right opposite it, I had a big sign written, probably in about 1 metre high letters. And don't laugh at this, but it's what you did in those days, and it had in, put in or piss off. So that every time the players were having a shower, all they did was look at this big sign that this very professional coach had decided to put up. And of course a bit of a laugh for that from that day onwards over the years for those that could have remembered it. But I thought it was good and kept reminding them what my requirements were. They tested me out, being the local copper. They felt that I should go down to the pub with them after some of the games, and the first time I went down there was Dickie Edwards and Flash Nicholson, and I think Ricky Lewis might have been there. We all went to the local Chinese shop, sat down and ordered up big 2 or 3 courses each. I went to the toilet. When I came back, everybody had gone. I got left with a bill for $50. So I suddenly woke up to take the coach out and test him. So I caught up with him on the training track. So it was all good stuff. One of the big problems I had from the professional side of it in coaching was that our ground was smaller than what it is now, even a bit narrower and a bit shorter, and we had a lot of trouble even when Ray Davies had his teams there in the previous 3 years. You could win games at home, but when you went on the big grounds, we had a lot of difficulty. So I had to come up with some way of, after being on our sandy ground where you could run like a hare and play a certain brand of football. How do we get around that? Well, I used to divide our ground up so we'd only actually train on 2/3 of it, and the other third part of the ground we used to kick wide to, and that was the area that I felt we had to run harder and work harder on that extra third of the ground that we used. A bit complicated to understand what I'm talking about, but that got us around the width of the ground, and we kept winning as many away games as I desired. And our scores back then were probably averaging in the mid-20s as far as goal kicking was going. Then I had to come up with how we managed to get by playing on the muddy ground. So in the little park opposite here where I'm talking, there was it wasn't a lake then, but it may as well have been. It was just a mud heap. So during winter we'd go over there and we'd dig up as much mud as we can before training night, and we'd go over and we'd train in about 3 inches of mud, skidding and so forth through mud. Probably for an hour and a half of a night until they were thoroughly exhausted. Their mouths and their bum holes would be stuffed full of mud, and that taught us so that we went to some of these other grounds where they had cricket pitches, we could cope with it. I felt it was a good method anyhow. I can remember one night when we'd done it really, really hard and I'd turned me back on them. Half a dozen grabbed me and I never found out who they were, carted me back to the mud, put me face down, sat on me with my face buried in the mud. So it was all good fun stuff.
Bryan was economical with words, very straight to the point, could bring you down in an instant with a couple of words, and also could elevate you with a couple of words. And I think the testimony to his success was his management skills, and he was able to cuddle when required and to give a rocket when required. And depending on the individual, their ability to take that as given. And as I stated earlier, I needed cuddling more than I needed rockets. So Bryan gave me a reasonable rocket midway through the year, where I just decided to take a hiatus and went to Sydney for a few weeks. And I think we lost a game over at Northcote, I think, in the wet, and I didn't play. And when I came back to training, I thought I'd come back to celebration. Oh, Jonesy's back in town, and no, I didn't get that. I got told to run 5 laps, and I'd let the team down terribly, and devastated me that Bryan Mace thought I'd let Frankston Football Club down. And I had a long, hard think about that, and it just went up from there. I started playing better and worked our way into final series and ultimate grand final. And undoubtedly, the lessons learned from Bryan have held me in good stead. You know, I don't think I coached very well. I don't think I had that ability to know who I was talking to. I expected everybody to just toe the company line, and I didn't have those skills. I wish I'd taken what I'd learned from Bryan onto my coaching days, but I couldn't do that. But he certainly gave me, as a young man, a goal. He gave me great leadership, and I'll be forever grateful for that 1 year that Bryan coached us.
Just the godfather of the footy club, really. Was obviously here throughout the whole period that I was here. Phenomenal time and effort that he put into the club. His passion for the club over all those years. You know, really fought for what the club was about, and its identity, really. And especially I talked about earlier on, through that time where alignments were happening. You know, he really stood tall. Led all of that, fought the AFL, VFL for extra funding and support to make sure that, you know, the club, like I said, kept its identity, could represent the peninsula, if you like, be a pathway for local kids and those that maybe fell short through the Stingray or the under-18 competition. Macy become really close for me and Dot and his family. I watched Anna grow up through here, his daughter. So Bryan really had a strong influence on me. Loved listening to all his stories, not just about footy, but his time as a police officer and so forth. I used to enjoy getting here, training early, and sit in the office out there with Macy and listen to his stories. So just been a really wonderful person for this footy club. in my opinion. A lot of hard work and effort that's gone through, and for me personally, I see Bryan as a good mate and a good friend, and thank him for everything he did for me when I was at the footy club, and everything he's done for the footy club and everybody that's been through the footy club. So, really special person, yeah.
Finished up 1978, we won the flag, and of course for a couple of years I've got the ego, like all coaches do when you've won a flag, and like your administration do. And in 78 a lot of people were stuck around the club. I won't repeat what had happened in 77. We went broke. The people that had been here in 77 did a lot of good things in relation to, they started our Sunday market. Norm Spencer and others on the committee started off our Sunday market, which was a good thing. But unfortunately, those particular people, they didn't get a lot of the Frankston people behind them and helping. I felt a little bit sorry for them. They were put into place by an old committee, and they were expected to take us to high places. 76, they had their chance. We shouldn't have lost that particular group of finals. 77, things started to collapse. The club was wound up midway through 77, went broke. So in 78, I had the chance of getting the coaching job. I was offered it to me simply because I wouldn't get paid. I was told by Alan Wicks, who I should mention at this stage had stuck with the club through 77 and pulled things together again with a group of good businessmen, being a Stuart Webster, a Bill Livingston, and another groups, Barry Cameron and others. I shouldn't mention names because there'll be others whose names I just can't recall at the moment, but they stuck together and got bingo going and managed to hold the club together. We went out of business for a few days. There was no club. We paid back our creditors 10 cents in the dollar. Most of them that we owed money to overlooked us and let us off, so we got the club going again. But we had to tell the players in 78 we wouldn't be paying them. I was a bit of a monster, a bit of a disciplinarian. They could see that I was determined to go places. To cut a long story short, the players really stuck together. The group I had around me with Kenny Armstrong and Don Reeves and a lot of other really, really good people. The trainers, a whole lot got behind the club, and there's nothing like the sympathy vote when you're down and out, you've got hardship. You can often make things work better then than what you do when you've got plenty of money and everyone's patting themselves on the back but not actually doing anything. I knew that I was going to go through and win a grand final. People say, well, how would you know that at the start of the year? Well, that's just the sort of guy I am. I was determined to win a grand final. Well, I got determined about anything with football, the same as what I did in 76 when we came from not winning games the year before to winning a flag. I was determined to do the same thing again. So I'd work at home until midnight after training. It didn't matter what shifts I was doing in the police force. I'd come home and just work and work and work and work at it until I had the right people and had the right players, and then it was just a case of good coaching. I've been very lucky. My wife, Margaret, as of then, she was joined the ladies committee. I think she was president of the ladies committee. I had Robert, who went on to win the best and fairest in 78 and later go on to play 80 and 90 games of AFL, VFL football with Hawthorns and Kilda, and then the Brisbane Bears, as they were called then, and young John, who'd been a very good footballer, my youngest son. He was a very good player. Unfortunately, John had an accident and run into what was then unprotected goal post and stuffed up his hip, and that all calcified, and then later on had a very bad illness where he had meningitis. He had to have a big operation on his brain, had to cut all his ear open and drain fluid off the brain, and we were frightened of losing him for about 3 or 4 months at that stage. So John tried to come back and play football with a helmet on, but it didn't work. I couldn't stand to watch him play after knowing what his head injury had been. So we cleared him to Morty Alec. He'd never forgiven me. He only played for a short time there and got knocked out a couple of times, because once you wear a helmet, everyone picks on you. So John had to turn to tennis, became a good tennis player, but it was a family concern, and Robert was a very good player in 78, and the whole peninsula and all Frankston got behind us, and you know, without going on about it too much, we had a marvellous year, and it really put us on the map. We moved up into first division in '79, and Chris Pavlo had been my assistant coach here in '78. He coached us. We won 6 games. That was pretty good. I wasn't playing much of a role then, as I couldn't go on with the coaching because it was a case of either coach or continuing on with my career path in the police force, and I was due to get my promotion to an officer, the officer rank, and I was wanting to finish up at the rank of a detective chief inspector, which I did do, but it was only through leaving the coaching and concentrating on, had to live in for a while and do exams and courses for 3 and 4 months at a time, firstly in Melbourne and then up in Sydney for a few weeks. I had to do all these courses, and I just couldn't continue on with coaching. And I love coaching, but having a family and not much money, you had to go with your career path, which is what I did. But I managed to stop on the committee. So I finished up being on the committee from about '78 right through, God only knows how long, right through up until about 2012, I think. I was on the committee. So I stopped on. We had a good manager was at the club, and he'd started in '78. We started to experiment with Adrian Lloyd and his times here, and he eventually left his job and took it on full time here 2 or 3 years later. And Adrian Lloyd was a very, very good operator, and we got on pretty well back in those days. So as soon as I'd knock off at work, whether it be at 11 o'clock at night or I was on shift work 7 a.m. in the morning, I'd come down and put in hour after hour here with Adrian. He did all the marketing and raised the money, and I concentrated on the team side of things. I did a lot of recruiting, a lot of actual building work around the club, because I might have forgot to mention earlier, I had been a carpenter. I'd served an apprenticeship and did a lot of building while I was even in the police force doing shift work and football club. So I was a busy boy, a bit like my old man. He'd been a workaholic and I was the same, but my whole family were involved here, and it was a great thing, and they all put in here. I did a lot of building, actually building cupboards, and I remember at one stage when Alan Clark came along to be president, we actually extended our club rooms, took it right through council. We extended our social rooms in here. I remember Robert and John, myself, Alan Clark, 2 or 3 people on the committee, they were electricians, so we developed all the old social room there. We built it ourselves. Years later, Alan Clark and I and a group of people went on and built the gaming room. We put in to get our licence for the gaming room, poured our own cold concrete. John Davis put the roof on the place. Because I was in the know with the police force, we were able to get the liquor licence through for it all. We were able to evade having to supply a certain number of car parking spaces. So we did a lot of actual practical work around and building the place with our hands. Perhaps that's why I'm so possessive about the place at the moment, because it wasn't just a case of walking in the door and doing a lot of lip reading or lip service to people and instructions. It was actually doing a lot of work by hand where we developed the club, and Alan Clark was one of the best presidents we ever had, because as well as being a good official and good with finances, he was very good with his hands and not frightened to bend his back. Anyhow, with Adrian Lloyd getting back, we worked our butts off through the years. We got to, when was it, 1984, and Josh Kendall, who was a good coach here, got us to a grand final. It was played at the Junction Oval against Preston. We did all right for the majority of the game, but they got over us in the end. Then we kept battling our way through good teams, depending on how much money you had. We'd have good years and bad years. If you had enough money to buy in 3 or 4 good players that you knew would stop with you for 3 or 4 years and give you a chance of getting up there, we'd do that. So if you ran out of money, you didn't get in your good players and you'd drop away a bit. So we went through this until we got to about the 90s, and we were able to build our gaming room here, and that started to bring in some extra money. So we had a fellow here by the name of Russell, that was the club manager, and we recruited David Rees-Jones here as a coach. 96, 97, 98. Well, he got us to 2 grand finals in 96 out at Carlton against Springvale, as it was called then, now Casey Scorpions. They beat us on the last kick of the day. I think it was 3 points. Very disappointing. Next year, Reece got us to another grand final against Sandringham at Port Melbourne, what was then the biggest crowd, 10 or 11,000 packed into Port Melbourne. Watched Frankston throw a grand final away because we went to fist instead of playing the ball, and Sandringham beat us, I think, by 4 or 5 goals in the finish. They got over us reasonably comfortably at the end of the day, but that was one that we threw away, which I'll always regret. We lost. We were probably a little bit top happy that we lost it, but the next year we got up into the final again and lost our first final. I think it was against Werribee, I can't quite remember. And Reece decided he couldn't get our club over the line in the grand final, so Reece decided to leave us. During this period, we'd had some really great coaches, big Mick Patterson, Swamp Fox, had us for a few years, got us to a final. I think it was around the early 80s from memory. He went back, left here to go back and coach at Richmond. We had Billy Barrett, was here for a couple of years with the reserves. He actually got us to 2 reserves grand finals, and by way of one was a draw, so we had to have another grand final that was played at Frankston Park, and I think it was Preston again that got over our reserves in the grand final. So we had some good teams. We had some good coaches. Robert, my son, coached here for had a couple of sessions, a bit like Josh Kendall. Robert insisted on bringing young players here. I think it was 2001. Robert had a very good team. We sat on top of the ladder for most of the year, but we couldn't get over Casey Springvale at the end of the year. I decided when we got to 2000, I sort of threw my hands up in the air, because after Rees-Jones and our success, I'd finally felt that myself and others had got our club to a position now where we were looked upon as one of the top clubs, and all of a sudden the whole competition changed. They called themselves the State League around about 95, then the VFL started in 2000, and it was really all about the AFL reserves or seconds weren't allowed to play curtain raisers to their main games, so they had to find other venues and other clubs to get involved with. So I didn't like the idea. I went to meeting after meeting in at the head administration in Melbourne, the VFA, as a VFL as they now called themselves. The old VFA was defunct, it was given the flick. And I could see by all these lectures that we were going to that we were being coerced into becoming part of this new framework. So I suddenly thought, all of a sudden we've got our club to where it should be, the pinnacle of what was the VFA, and now we're going into a new competition where we'd be playing against the AFL reserves. Well, I knew what that was going to be all about. We'd be totally blanketed, a big blanket would be thrown over our club by the AFL clubs, and we'd have to start doing as we were told, and that's exactly what happened. A lot of the old VFA clubs started to align, Sandringham with Melbourne, and other clubs went to Collingwood, finished up at Williamstown and so on. Hawthorn went out to Box Hill and so on. Port Melbourne aligned with Sydney, so Sydney were flying players down to play at Port Melbourne. An hour before the match, a player would walk in from Sydney to play at Port Melbourne. They'd put an announcement over the system to say they now had 3 more players that have come down from the Swans to play at Port. We were starting to play night games in the middle of winter at Waverley. No one had turned up, it was too cold. We'd get thrashed. We had a game rostered on down at Geelong. It rained the night before, so Geelong decided we couldn't play there against their team. So at the last minute, only hours before the game, they rang us up and we had to transfer our game to the Footscray ground. All our supporters went to Geelong because we couldn't get notice to tell them what was going on. All that sort of stuff happened. We had a night game at North Ballarat, a night game at Bendigo. If you've ever played in the middle of winter at those grounds, you know that the people that do turn up to start to watch the game at 7 o'clock go home an hour later. So at half time, everybody vacated the ground. It's only the 30 or 40 so Frankston supporters that would stop and watch the game. So it was a total disaster, and a lot of those games have been put on simply to suit the AFL senior coaches. So if Mick Malthouse, who let's say was at Collingwood, he wanted to watch the Collingwood game, he made sure we played at a certain time, so we had time to leave that game and the next day be over in Western Australia or South Australia. So we were organised to suit the senior coaches of the AFL clubs, and to me this was all a total disaster, because we were being forced verbally and also by documentation to align with the club. We spoke to St Kilda. They didn't have much to offer. We spoke to Carlton. We found out in the grapevine that John Elliott, who was in charge then, was only interested in taking Carlton on simply because we had the poker machines, and back then anybody that had got a poker licence was bigger than Ben-Hur, and everyone wanted to become part of you so they could establish themselves there and grow bigger and better and include more pokers and so forth. We didn't go with Carlton. North Melbourne, we spoke to them on a couple of occasions. They were very keen to go with us, but all they'd supply us with would be 2 trainers and a doctor when they could afford to send a doctor. So they weren't going to pay for anything towards coaching or anything like that. So the whole thing was a lot of absolute bullshit, if I may use that expression. And I got that way knowing what I knew from going to all the meetings, that it would be very bad for us to align our clubs with another club, because I could see that in the short term of 10 or 12 years, and that's what it's turned out to be, the clubs, the AFL clubs, once they'd got their grounds, they wouldn't want to have anything to do with the minor side of the alignment, which would have been Frankston and your Sandringhams and your Caseys. And that's just what's happening. If you look at in the last couple of years, Collingwood have gone back to Collingwood, Footscray have gone back to Footscray, Carlton, well, Carlton call themselves another name, but it's really all Carlton, Preston. If you look at Box Hill, if we're honest enough with ourselves, Box Hill is straight out Hawthorn. And Box Hill Council like to call themselves Box Hill still, because it's good for the community, and it's a good thing for the council there, the city of Box Hill, to have it called Box Hill Hawks. But straight out Hawthorn. Casey will be on their own shortly, Sandringham will be on their own shortly. So we've gone right on, and I was a bully there in 2001, I think it was. We refused, the year that Robert was coaching, and it turned out to be a disaster. We refused to have a reserve side, and in all honesty, we refused to have a reserve side for one matter. We were out to upset the competition until we got, 200,000 in a grant to bring us up level with the Sandringhams, whereas it was costing us 250,000 a year. Put our team onto the ground, it was only costing Sandringham just over 100,000, because they were getting all this money poured into them by Melbourne and then later on St Kilda. We were missing out on all that. I could talk about for ages. By not having a reserves, it really threw the competition into array. I got into a lot of trouble from the senior administration, but we stuck to our guns. Unfortunately for Robert, it all blew up in his face, because we couldn't let on to the locals here that barracked for us what we were doing. We couldn't turn around and say, well, we're deliberately upsetting the competition, so they realised that a strong club's being ruined by the blanket that's being thrown over a standalone club, and we've been the only standalone club right through. So one good thing did come out of it. We got our grant put up to 120,000. It's now gone up to over 200,000. We got the rights then to have two televised games a year, an extra home game, and a whole lot of other things happened to us. We also got the Stingrays regionalised to us and not just left willy-nilly to be able to go anywhere. So by not having a reserves and getting most of the locals offside, we finished up making our club stronger than ever. My determination then was not to concentrate on having really good teams, because I could see it was pouring money down the drain. We weren't going to go anywhere, because unless we spent an absolute fortune and send ourselves broke, we would never compete with clubs that had 10, 11 and 12 senior AFL players, and then the best picks drafted players from all around Australia. against our local kids here who could play good football but week after week couldn't come up with that. People might say, well, Port Melbourne went on and did it and so did Williamstown. Well, I know the backbone of where Port Melbourne's finances come from. They get their finances from the hotel that was virtually donated to them by a man's name I won't mention, and the proceeds from the gaming go to Port Melbourne. So they've had a lifeline there, and they've now gone on, built their function centre, and good luck to them. They're a well-run club, and I've got a lot of admiration for their manager. Williamstown had the great thing happen down there. They've got their number one ticket holder made sure that they got looked after down there. They've got their own pub and their pokies, and they've got the financial structure behind them to get where they did. Whilst all this was going on, the state government put in $10 million towards the improvement of facilities at the VFL grounds. Right at this time, 2008, that this was happening, St Kilda and Council decided the Saints were going to come here. And because the Saints were going to come here and so much money would be poured into developing our ground, we then missed out on the 10,000 that was to be dispersed amongst the clubs by way of the state government and the VFL. We missed out on that. Then all of a sudden, all the meetings that was going on about the St Kilda business, I could see us losing our identity. So I sent our staff up, 2 of our girls up to Melbourne to go through and research what had happened from all the newspaper articles, what happened when St Kilda came to Moorabbin and kicked Moorabbin out of the Moorabbin ground. Moorabbin just disappeared. So I had all these newspaper articles and I took them over to council and I said, this is what's going to happen to us if St Kilda come here. Exactly what happened to Moorabbin back in '66 when the Saints took over and kicked the Moorabbin footy club out of the ground. So I started to put a lot of pressure on people about what would happen to us, and the promise was made to me that if I didn't object about St Kilda coming here, the council would see that we'd get a lot of assistance financially to build new social rooms. So I worked at that, and then St Kilda weren't coming here. I heard on the grapevine because they couldn't build down between the churches. Right at the time that decision was found out, the grandstand burnt down. St Kilda got the blame for that because everyone then felt that the Saints had burnt that down because they could build their new rooms where the grandstand was. I knew that wasn't true because I knew that the grandstand had been burnt down by a particular person who'd had, let's call him one of the homeless people who'd been living over in and around the grandstand, and he burnt it down because there'd been a big relationship going on between he and a woman and other men. I won't go into it, all scandalous sort of stuff. Interested me and a few at the time, but I told the police who it was. They got him in and questioned him, but had to let him go because he didn't admit it and he was let go, and at the moment he's back in prison over another matter anyhow. There were 2 or 3 other fires then around about that stage that were lit by that same guy trying to catch up with his enemy, and they were in that local toilet box. But that's all another thing. St Kilda didn't come here, so with St Kilda not coming here, they disappeared down to Belvedere Park. Our grandstand's burnt down. Our poor old coaches have got to go and train elsewhere because of the mess that was over here. So things started to happen then. That grandstand had only been rejuvenated only a couple of years before that, and the ground had been done up. We'd been looking good. So Brett Lovett had to go and do a lot of his coaching at away grounds, and the new grandstand got built, and I'd been putting a lot of pressure on council and the VFL to say, well, we want our share of the 10 million that was overlooked. Luckily, we had a swinging seat going here in our state government, so I went down and spoke to the member that was in charge down there, Mr Harkness, and he could understand that where I was coming from with newspaper articles and everything about this time. Frankston was being discriminated against quite heavily on some of the footy TV shows by certain individuals and who were visiting Frankston. We were getting rubbish. So I was using that little trademark, we might call it, that had been dealt upon us to put a lot of pressure on a lot of people. A lot of meetings went on. And I'm a pretty hard character to get off your tail once I get my teeth into something. A lot of work was put into it, hundreds and hundreds of hours while I was running the club with a lot of meetings. And luckily, because we had the swinging seat here, I'd been told we'd never get our share of the 10 million now. It had been spilt. But when I started to talk about discrimination, and 2 or 3, Vicky McCollum and 2 or 3 of the other councillors were well and truly on my side. Not only did we get $1.5 million from the state government, once that happened, well, AFL and VFL had to then throw in their 2 bobs worth. So we got 250,000 from AFL, 250,000 from VFL, $500,000 from council, 200,000 from Bruce on the corner here, Bruce Bilson. We were supposed to put in $500,000, and it all came together. A lot of bloody hard work behind it. So then the meetings with architects started, and went on and on and on. And at this stage, unfortunately, my health started to conk out a bit, so I was determined to stop on until the end of 2013, when I told the committee I'd be getting off the managementship role, and I could see things were coming together. They didn't get in another manager straight away. I couldn't work out why, so I did it voluntarily for another 12 months until the club put on another manager towards the end of 2014, about 2/3 of the way through the year they put on another manager. Now in the meantime I'd been working hand in hand with a lot of architects. We got the building underway, and we've now, as far as I'm concerned, we've now got a lovely social complex, a function area, and it's up to the club now to really promote this function area and start to, as I keep calling it, the golden goose has got to lay the golden egg, and I can't see any reason now why that can't happen. From my personal point of view, I feel quite satisfied. A lot of people mightn't have understood what went on behind the scenes. It couldn't be revealed, but my attitude was, firstly, from 2002, that was a waste of time throwing a lot of money into it. The concentration should go to building up the club and putting things together, so that in future years we had something here where the club, instead of going hand in hand around the various people looking for money, the club could be in a position where it could keep itself. So let's say during the last 15 years, through our most traumatic period that the club's ever been through, with all the standalone and the alignments and competing against AFL clubs and have the blanket thrown over us, we've come out after 15 years of absolute Tommy rot. At the end of the 15 years we've come out, which is something really, really great, which was a fantastic new grandstand worth a couple of million, grounds worth $1.5 million all redone, external fences, internal fences, terracing, and club rooms valued at about $4 million. I reckon myself and the other 2 or 3 guys that stuck with me have done a bloody good job. Thank you all very much.
strange